morning. Also from my side, I'm super excited and very honored to be trusted with kicking off these two very dense, content-packed days that we'll have on sustainability, in particular net zero. And I hope you will enjoy it, and I think I really want to endorse us getting here together and talking and sharing with each other. But I'd particularly like to start with acknowledging perhaps that we're coming together on this wonderful day in March 2024 at a very challenging time. I think it's never been more evident that action on climate is urgently needed. It's also never been clearer before how businesses can contribute by going for net zero, by following the standard for setting themselves targets for the long term. And yet it feels sometimes like it's never been more difficult to cut through the noise of distraction and of worry about our fundamental societal fabric and political fabric that we have to make that transformation happening. I don't know how it feels about you, but I sometimes have a very strong sense of exhaustion because, of course, you have to have a functioning society, a functioning political system for these sort of enormous challenges to work through. And I'm really quite worried about the seeming weakness of our democracies or the relentless rise of populism, which also goes together often with a consistent ignorance and resistance against scientific evidence on climate. And of course, it comes then also with a general feeling of geopolitical, insecurity and wars. That is a very difficult dynamic to be thinking about global solutions. And I fundamentally thought, perhaps you as well, that the global climate policy could be something like a new way for global governance. I'm not so sure at the moment anymore, and I'm not quite sure where it is going. But I know one thing, which is there's no option to not consistently and relentlessly keep pushing for climate action. There is no way, there is no option but to keep going, to be persistent, and to actually work on this, because there's no option to give up. I also know a second thing, which is we can be confident, especially as a business community, because action on climate, and particularly going for net zero, absolutely makes business sense, because it is building resilience. It is building supplier and supply chain diversification. And ultimately, it makes the business more competitive. And the third thing is we can build on our community. We're not alone here. And looking at this big auditorium, and probably all the people out there as well, these days, these meetings are there to share, to learn, to calibrate, to reassure yourselves that you are on the right track and that you can learn what's happening outside, so you can come back and actually keep fighting going forward. So I'm really quite optimistic at the end of the day that as we come out here, we are newly energized because we have no other option than to do so. So let me perhaps go back to start, and I'm not going to dwell a long time on this, because where are we today on climate? And it's very clearly a very difficult spot. I'm sure you are all up to speed on the science, and you will have more information of gloom in the next 2 days, so I'm not going to talk much more about this. But what strikes me really every day is that until a few years ago, the things that we're seeing now every day seem to be an abstract forecast, something that might happen, but nobody could really imagine it actually to be true. And now it is true, and we're still there debating whether perhaps slowly, occasionally, we might actually phase down or out fossil fuels, or maybe perhaps we just keep going for mere years. And it makes really no much sense, actually. But now I'm not working in the energy industry, but I think for the rest of us, I think we can count one and one together. And it's very simple that climate failure needs to nature failure. With global warming, climate change, we have more soil erosion, we have more droughts, we have less water where we need it, we have less biodiversity, and we're undermining the simple resources, the essential resources of humanity. And if communities can't thrive, peoples are suffering, well, they're going to start moving. And if they start moving, they're going to start fighting. And so climate failure ultimately is going to lead to societal failure. And I haven't seen a scenario yet where an economy can thrive, a business can be healthy in a situation of chaos. So very clearly, that scenario isn't all that abstract, isn't all that far away. And so businesses really need to take action in their own interest. And that's what I think takes me back to we have and we're on the right path to be leading that action. And we don't have to look too far, actually, to see this already playing out in the numbers. So just if we look at last year, the combined losses from climate-related events stand to about 250 billion US dollars. And only, by the way, 120 billion of those were actually insured. And if we project forward in the next 25 years, about 18% of GDP could be impacted by climate-related impacts. And that's a bit less than our G7 combined GDP today. So it is very substantial. And for each company, on average, around 3% of the global assets of companies is under risk every year from climate-related events. And in some occasions, it can go up to a third of the asset value of an organization. So there's a lot of economic value on the line. But here's the good news, and I wouldn't have thought that with the sign of the stars of the Europe, I would sort of start with the good news of my speech. But I don't think really that we have to wait for the declarations of the COP to start moving. I think the imperative for business action is already here. And why do I think that? For one, because most of the technologies for low carbon transformation, we already have invented, if you like. We have renewable energies, we have the solar, wind, sea, geothermal. We have storage capacities, we have the grids, we know how to do hydrogen, by and large, carbon capture. They exist. It's a matter of scaling them up, ramping them up, rolling out, and commercialization. That is not an easy task. I'm not saying that's going to happen sort of by the by. And of course, the returns are not really stacking up today. But simply the increasing carbon prices and the scarcity of renewable and low carbon materials will be changing that game very quickly. And we see today already many countries, look no further than China, massively investing in rolling out and scaling up because they know this is going to shape their economies as the future powerhouses. I'd also say a word for regulation because obviously it's on a mission, but I think for us and for the sustainability community, there are aspects that are really helping. And one of them is that regulation is increasing, simply put, the cost of doing business, the cost of using energy, the cost of creating waste, the cost of emitting carbon, the cost of producing or using water in water-stressed areas. We might not feel it or we might not put the dots together yet, but it's actually going to stack up. And frankly, that is something that the sustainability community needs. We need an economic shift, a cost shift of what actually is worthwhile investing in, where to produce in the future, and where to allocate our capital. And with that allocation of capital, I also come to the transparency regulation that we have coming out and rolling out, and not only in Europe. Yeah? It's not only Europe, it is other regions as well, North America and Asia. The connection between the sustainability activities of an organization, of a company, and its capital markets. The connection between sustainability action and allocation of capital. That's going via partly the disclosure requirements, so the new transparency regulations that we see, and the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and other thereof are forcing companies to systematically and very uniformly assess and quantify financially the impacts, the risks, and the opportunities they are causing or they're having or sustainability is causing for them. And they really need to think about how they're explaining to their investors and the capital markets how they're not only going to build more resilience into their organization in the future, but how they're going to make money also off the sustainability-related elements. It is, at the moment, still a bit of a touch and go in understanding how it will play out, but I'm very confident that reporting will be leading to more action. And the third piece, of course, it's around competitiveness. We already see customers require that we contribute to their Scope 3 emission targets that we're filling in the EcoVadis questionnaire, that we are reporting against CDP, that we're reporting and measuring product carbon footprints. And of course, at some point, very soon, they will decide who they want to partner with and who they want to have on their shelves and who they want to buy products from. We do the same with our suppliers. So let me just then gear to the practical side. How do we get to net zero? And obviously, there's not one approach for all companies, right? Every company has to figure out where its own story is, where its own opportunities are, how it can make it happen. And at Henkel, our opportunity is simply in the duality of having a consumer business and an industrial technologies organization wrapped in one company. We can innovate, we can influence. We are a customer, we are a supplier. We can enable and we can drive. We are 50,000 people and we are also a family organization. So we have, that is our story, that is our unique way of leveraging what we do to build a low carbon future, and so is yours. You have your own very unique story. But what's important really at the end of the day is that we want to be accountable for our commitments, for our targets, that we want to be part of collective action, that we don't want to go alone, that we think we have to go together, and that we want to make our actions also really count for climate. And this is why we have had climate targets in place since 2010, and we had science-based climate targets since 2019, and we're now on the next step to go to net zero. Because we know, even with our achievements today, and we really put an effort into this decade, we said we wanted to go early and we wanted to go far this decade and not leave it to the long-distant future, we still have to step up. We have reduced our CO2 emissions in production per ton of product by 67%. We are now at 89, nearly 90% renewables, electricity in our production. We are making progress on Scope 3 reductions, and we have helped avoid 89 million tons of CO2 on our customer side. So we are working across the value chain to make that work, but we know we have to do more. And I don't want you to get the impression, closing out a little, that we have it all figured out. I don't want to leave you the impression, oh, it's yes, another hero story here on stage, and they all know, and we're all struggling. We're all struggling. And I really want to go perhaps a little bit practical to be closing, because the road to net zero, making those commitments and taking that action is really paved with challenges. And management, I found many leaders, they're struggling, of course, with the uncertainty and the lack of visibility of that future, what's happening and what actually is the transaction. We're talking about 20, 25, 30 years out here. We're not really clear what's going to happen in the next 5. Or that they're really struggling with taking commitments for a future of leaders that are not even there once they are gone. So how can they put that task out there? Or they hesitate simply to make investments today in times of economic crisis and sign the organization up for something that it might be too heavy to lift. And yet we have to make it happen. So let me just share very quickly what worked for us, for me, what we have done. Perhaps some of that you will recognize, maybe most of it you will recognize, then take it as reassurance. Otherwise, perhaps there are some things that you can take away. One is make sure you refresh on the basics. Never assume that your leadership knows the whole story of your climate legacy or where you are or what the targets are or whatever. There's so much going on. Base them, ground themselves. We spend a lot of time and good time, really good conversations, going through sometimes very technical issues, but it's very important that they get not only the gist of what are the principles, the basics of accounting standards or of target setting standards, but also how is this playing out in your organizations? What is the fluidity? What is the uncertainty? How might that change certain things having an effect? It is important because greenhouse gases is the new currency, and they have to understand that currency like they understand their EBIT. Yeah, it is something that leaders today have to really understand, and taking that time, working that through, working on the upskilling, even if they don't sometimes like it, not initially, is really important. The second thing is we worked a lot with our businesses to go in our emission categories one by one and look for each of the 2 businesses, how does this play out for you? Where are your biggest impacts relatively? And with 2 very different businesses, we have 2 very different profiles of emissions. And to really go systematically, how do you actually can create and identify levers for transformation? How does this work in your supply chain? Build on the supplier insights, build off industry and sector insights to understand what you can do, what are the main points that you can actually start driving. Never assume, though, that you will have all the picture, right? You never know what's going to happen. You have an idea of what the technologies are. You don't know when they come online, when they're actually going to come in the market. But at least you have a direction that you can work with. The third piece is we partnered a lot with finance. Because, of course, it is a lot of estimations on numbers. If everything is fluid, if everything is uncertain, it's very much estimation on the financial impacts. But I found it is better to have a big number estimated than a black box that nobody knows. Yeah, so looking at current spend, looking at an extrapolation of the targets and the investments in the future going in the long term, looking at the cost of doing nothing. We applied carbon prices to sort of say, look, if we just continue like this, what is the anyway spend that we will have? Puts things into perspective. Quantify the impacts of climate risks as well. These are all numbers that putting together gives a very important message, even though it is with a big health warning that it's just at the moment an estimation. And my final point is really, in order to drive action, you have to have a governance in place, an organizational setup with your business that makes you look and evaluate at your initiatives and make decisions on whether they actually make sense, whether they get you forward. Otherwise, you have a lot of stuff going on that not necessarily adds up to what you want to achieve. So the governance is important, and as part of the governance, I really invite you to look at the health and the robustness of your data systems. Because without good data, you cannot really steer this whole debate very well. We know all that on data, particular climate data, particular scope 3 data, we're still calculating, approximating, estimating. It's fine, we are on a journey. But really look at how you start ramping up the robustness, the granularity of the data, and make it actionable and informative for those discussions. That is something that needs to happen now to actually be in place in the next years when you actually need to start reporting then and steering. So I close out. So as you go on, really, let's make that change happen together as you are sitting here and perhaps taking some actions go around. Let's drive the collective action. It is important that we are on the same hymn sheet, and by being committed as an SBTi company, you are joining a club of many thousand companies. Many of you will find are your suppliers. Many of them you might find are your customers. And this is an important message. And you will inspire others to join, and then the effect is even bigger. And by signing up to net zero, you will also give an important message to your market, to your suppliers in particular, that you are serious about it and that they need to get moving. We have to have that message, that signal, that things are really getting real. So I wish you a very good 2 days. Lots of engagements, lots of motivation, lots of good examples. Get inspired and inspire others that the net zero transformation is a real positive vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike. Great way to start the session, great way to start today as well. As you can see, Ulrike also features in our Women in Sustainability Top 100, which is coming out on Friday. Handy bit of cross-pollinated marketing there. Just one question from me. You talked there, you shared some really interesting stats and data, and you said, you know, there's still a lot to achieve. So what's the biggest challenge that you still face as an organisation? And I realise there's many challenges. What's the single biggest challenge you face?
Well, the biggest piece, of course, we can talk about setting targets, we can talk about commitments, we can talk about how wonderfully we disclose against it. It is about the action, right? It is about being sure that you actually can put in place new supply chains, change your supply chains, work with your suppliers to really get on the wagon, get on the trails to decarbonize. In our industry, we are chemical industry ultimately, yeah? Personal consumer goods or industrial technologies. Our base of material that we are using to produce our products comes out of the chemical industry. It's a very, very highly developed, interlocked and intersectioned sector. And so it is very hard and very efficient, right, in what it's done for the last decades and hundreds of years. So turning that around is a big, big challenge. I'm sure there are other sectors that have equally big challenges, but clearly you have to understand that and then to work away bit by bit to start getting the ball rolling.
Okay, thank you again, Ulrike.
Thank
Great
you.
start to the show. Thank you.